Hi, my name is Isabel Hart, 24 years old, and I have just completed my master's degree in business administration at New York University, a milestone I had sacrificed so much to achieve. The graduation ceremony unfolded in applause, camera flashes, and congratulatory hugs from friends and professors. I looked around, and in that sea of faces, I only saw the familiar smiles of classmates, while the seats reserved for family remained empty. My parents weren't there. They were busy hosting a small celebration for my younger sister, Sophia, the daughter who had always been the star in their eyes. I had long grown used to it. Their absence no longer brought me to tears the way it once had when I was a child, but it still left a hollow space in my chest. Just as I stepped out of the auditorium, graduation cap still in hand, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was unusually sweet. "Isabel, your father and I want you to come home. We need to have an important family meeting. Darling, think of it as a fresh start." I froze for a moment, then agreed. My instincts told me this was no ordinary invitation, yet I still went because I wanted to see what game they were playing this time. 3 days later, I drove back to Connecticut, to the large house my parents called the perfect family home, though it had never made me feel like I belonged. As I pulled up to the gate, my heart pounded faster than usual. I walked into the living room and immediately realized I had stepped into a carefully arranged trap. There was no reunion, no flowers, no congratulatory cake. On the long walnut table lay neatly stacked documents, and across from them sat two men in black suits, clearly lawyers. My parents, forcing strained smiles, gestured for me to sit down. Sophia was there too, her eyes bright with anticipation as if she were about to be handed a birthday present. I took a deep breath. All the exhaustion from months of grueling study, all the pain of years spent on the outside looking in, came rushing back at once. It was my mother who spoke first. She slid the papers toward me, her voice both syrupy and commanding. "Darling, this is the updated inheritance agreement. Your grandparents left you the old house in Vermont along with their investment portfolio, but you know very well that Sophia needs it more. You're the older sister, you should be willing to step aside for her." My eyes dropped to the first page of the contract, scanning the cold lines of text, a full transfer of all assets into Sophia Hart's name. My chest tightened, though I kept my expression calm. That old house was not just bricks and beams, it held the memories of my childhood with my grandparents, it was breath and history woven together. And that portfolio was not just numbers on a page, it was the sweat and lifelong savings of the people who had loved me most. Now my parents wanted me to erase it all with a single signature. Shocked? Perhaps partly. Surprised? Not at all. I had spent my life watching them elevate Sophia above everything and reduce me to a shadow. I sat there with my hand resting lightly on the stack of papers, studying each face in front of me. My father avoided my eyes, as though he knew this was dirty business but chose silence as complicity. My mother held her head high, confident that her eldest daughter would bow, just as I always had. Sophia pressed her lips together, half nervous, half triumphant, waiting for the moment I surrendered my rightful share so she could once again claim the title of winner. I felt a wave rising inside me, but this time I refused to let it drown me. I remembered the words my grandfather had whispered to me before he passed away. "Isabel, they will try to take from you what we meant for you. But you must be strong. That inheritance is yours, both in body and in spirit. You must protect it." And in that moment, I knew I would not let my grandparents down. The air in the room was taut, stretched thin like the string of a violin. One of the lawyers cleared his throat and slid a pen toward me. "All you need to do is sign here, and everything will be resolved peacefully, for the good of the entire family." I lifted my head and smiled. It was a smile that unsettled them, because it wasn't the weary surrender they expected, but a calmness that carried defiance. Slowly, I set the pen down on the table without signing, then raised my eyes to meet my mother's gaze. "Interesting," I said, my voice deliberate and steady. "Because I brought someone of my own as well." In that instant, the room froze. The smile vanished from Sophia's lips, My father frowned, and my mother flinched ever so slightly before hiding it behind a cold, sharp stare. The back door creaked open, and I knew this was only the beginning of the real battle. Have you ever felt hurt, abandoned, or belittled by your own family the way I have? And where are you watching this story from? Tell me in the comments, so I'll know I'm not alone in this journey. As I sat there in that room, faced with the stack of papers and the heavy stares pressing down on me, I couldn't stop my mind from drifting backward into memory. Perhaps, to understand why I was here today, why I had to brace myself as though against enemies rather than my own parents, you need to hear the story from the start, from when I was just a child in this very house. I was the eldest, the first shadow of expectation, the standard against which everything else would be measured. And then Sophia was born, and everything changed. I became the comparison, and she became the embodiment of what they called perfection. 1. Every time I brought home an A on my report card, my mother would remind me, "That's fine, but your sister will do even better." Each time I won a small prize in a school competition, my father would shrug, "Sophia has natural talent. You're only good because you work hard, but there's nothing truly special about you." Words like that, repeated over and over, carve deeper than you realize. After a while, you stop hoping, stop wanting recognition. You just learn to stay silent, to avoid new wounds being etched into your heart. My mother, Caroline, was always suffocatingly strict. She could spend hours choosing a dress for a dinner party, but never seemed to spare 10 minutes to ask if I was okay, if I needed a hug after failing at something. To her, social image was the treasure worth preserving. Her children's emotions were merely an afterthought. I still remember vividly one parent-teacher meeting. My teacher praised me for being diligent and resilient, but instead of showing pride, my mother adjusted her hair, offered a polite smile to the other parents, and said, "Yes, Isabel is well behaved, but my greatest expectations are with Sophia. She has a rare presence." Right then and there, I felt like an outsider in my own family's story. My father, David, was a successful man in the public eye, working in finance, always appearing in sharp suits with a polished smile. But at home, he never hid his favoritism. He always defended my mother, stood by her in every argument, and almost never once spoke up to support me. When I asked permission to attend an academic summer camp I had earned through a scholarship, he frowned. "You're wasting time on things that bring no real value. Sophia will be taking a summer dance class, which at least contributes to her image." To him, value didn't lie in knowledge or effort, but in whatever could enhance the family's reputation. And Sophia, of course, was the shining mirror they proudly displayed to the world. Sophia, the youngest and the precious jewel, lived inside a bubble of unconditional indulgence. At just 16, she was gifted a brand new red car, the keys tucked into a sparkling box at the center of her birthday party. I still remember that moment. The entire room erupted in cheers, Sophia's friends rushed outside to take photos, and my mother glowed as if she herself had just won some grand competition. And me? I sat quietly in the corner, forcing a polite smile, with only a few crumpled bills in my pocket from long shifts at the cafe. In the years that followed, Sophia never had to worry about tuition. My parents paid everything for her without hesitation, even hiring private tutors to give her extra advantages. Every birthday, every holiday, Sophia had lavish parties, international trips, while I carefully counted every dollar to buy textbooks, working myself to exhaustion just to cover my college expenses. As for me, I grew up in my sister's shadow, carrying responsibilities without ever receiving recognition. By the age of 14, I was already managing household chores, tutoring Sophia, and driving her to practices whenever our parents were busy. Yet all I ever received in return were sharp words and blame whenever I made the smallest mistake. I learned how to secure scholarships because my parents never had any intention of funding me the way they did for Sophia. I learned how to work in the dorms, covering evening shifts at the library and morning shifts at the cafe, just to afford food and supplies. While Sophia flaunted her new dresses, I took pride in being able to pay my phone bill without asking anyone for help. Over time, I realized there was a distance between me and my parents that could never be bridged, a distance built from constant favoritism, endless comparisons, and the quiet scars they left on my heart. Amid all that coldness, there was only one place where I truly felt loved: my grandparents' home. The old wooden house, with the familiar scent of pine resin and the creak of the floorboards underfoot, was where I found comfort. My grandparents never compared me to Sophia. They listened when I told them stories about school, encouraged me when I felt weary, and praised me not for achievements but for perseverance. My grandfather would take me out to the garden and teach me to recognize different trees and types of wood. My grandmother, sitting in the living room with her knitting, would call me over, her hands busy with the yarn while she shared stories from her youth. Every time I went there, I felt whole, not a shadow, not a comparison meant to glorify someone else. That warmth was what kept me standing tall through all the years when my parents slowly began treating me like a stranger. And so, when my grandparents decided to leave me the old house along with their investment, I knew it was because they had seen me, they had understood, and they had chosen to place their trust in me. Their timber farm in Vermont lives in my memory as a sanctuary, a place I cherish more than anything else. It wasn't just a stretch of land lined with tall trees, but an entire world where I first learned the value of labor, of persistence, and most importantly, of unconditional love. Their old house, built in the 1922nd, stood humbly among the maple and pine forests. Each time I stepped onto the wooden porch, the mingling scents of fresh resin and the pies my grandmother baked filled the air, and I felt as though I was returning to the one place in life that truly welcomed me. There, I was not Sophia's shadow, not the child endlessly compared. I was simply Isabel, the granddaughter they loved. My grandfather, a rugged yet gentle man, had run the timber farm for decades. He was not wealthy in the way my mother craved, but he was rich in ways that few people ever are: rich in love, in integrity, and in faith in honest work. He taught me how to distinguish one wood from another, how to trace the lines in the grain to read the age of a tree. He often told me, "A good house is built with hands and with heart, not just with money." On summer afternoons, when the sunlight painted the forest in gold, he would take me into the workshop, hand me a small plane, and patiently guide me through each movement. I can still remember how my little hands trembled, but his eyes shone with trust. That single look was enough to make me feel valuable, so different from the indifference I received at home. My grandmother was another world, entirely gentle, full of care. She loved to sit by the window, knitting while she told me stories about her youth, about how she and my grandfather endured the hardest years together. She always looked at me with tenderness, smoothing my hair and whispering, "Isabel, you are stronger than you think. Don't ever let anyone make you believe you are unworthy." Each word from her was like a balm, helping me rise each time I returned to the main house where I was once again reduced to the unwanted child. I came to see that my grandparents were not only my refuge, but also the quiet source of strength that carried me through my education and into adulthood. Years passed like that, and gradually I became inseparable from their lives. While my parents were busy hosting lavish parties for Sophia, I spent weekends tending the orchard with my grandfather, accompanying my grandmother to the local market, or simply sitting on the porch, listening to the wind whisper through the forest. I grew up in that warmth, learning that a person's worth is not measured by how loudly they are praised, but by holding on to who they are, living with honesty, and showing love to others. Those lessons shaped the Isabel who now sits in that room filled with lawyers and contracts, no longer trembling like the little girl I once was. Before they passed, my grandparents called me to them on a late autumn afternoon. I remember clearly the maple leaves carpeting the path, painting the yard in red. My grandfather sat on his old wooden chair, his face etched with deep lines, but his eyes still sharp. He held my hand, his voice raspy yet steady. "Isabel, you are the only one we trust to preserve the values of this family. This property, this house, it is not just money. It is history, memory, and the love of generations. Protect it. Don't let anyone take it away." My grandmother sat beside him, nodding, her eyes glistening with tears. "That's right, my dear. The most precious inheritance isn't the money in the bank, but the way you hold your heart steady through the storms. They gave me not only responsibility, but their faith that I was strong enough to stand tall even if the whole world turned its back. Not long after, they were gone, leaving an unfillable emptiness inside me. But they also left behind a will, written with absolute clarity. The old house and the investment portfolio they had spent years building would belong to me. My parents' names were nowhere in that document, and that omission said it all. My grandparents knew their true nature. They knew that if left to them, everything would be sold off for luxury cars and glittering parties. And me? The one who had always been overlooked, dismissed. I was the one they trusted above all. When I held that will in my hands, I cried not from joy, but from the deep relief of finally being seen, of finally having my effort and dignity recognized. From that day on, I made a promise to myself. I would protect this inheritance with everything I had. Not just because of the $2.5 million value or the old house, but because it was the only proof of love and trust my grandparents had given me. I would not let anyone, not my parents, not Sophia, lay a hand on what was not theirs. I would keep my promise to them, to live with integrity, to be strong, and to guard the family's values. That promise is what gave me the strength to sit upright beneath my parents' cold stares, to smile when their lawyers pushed contracts across the table. Because I knew, deep down, I was not alone. I carried with me my grandparents' love and faith, and that made me stronger than I had ever been. After the funeral, when the wreaths hadn't yet wilted and the scent of incense still lingered in the wooden house, I already knew another storm was coming. And just as I expected, the phone began to ring without pause. At first, it was my mother's voice, dripping with sweetness, the kind I knew all too well was only a mask for calculation. "Isabel, I know you're grieving after losing your grandparents, but darling, Sophia is their granddaughter too. They loved you, yes, but just because they left everything to you doesn't mean you should keep it all for yourself. You should share with your sister, that would be fair." I gripped the phone tightly, listening to every word. Fairness? Hearing that word from my mother's mouth was bitter beyond belief. In this family, fairness had never existed. But I didn't argue. I simply said, "Grandpa and Grandma already made their decision. I will respect their will." A few days later, the tone had changed. This time it was my father, David, the man who always kept a polished image in public but could never hide his coldness when speaking to me. "Isabel, stop being stubborn. Your mother and I raised you, paid for your education all these years. Don't you think you owe us some gratitude? Don't you care about your parents' feelings? Sophia is just starting out in her career. She needs the money more than you do." I bit my lip, each word cutting into me like a blade. That so-called gratitude he spoke of was nothing more than a way to legitimize stripping me of what my grandparents had entrusted to me. I answered, calm but unwavering. "I worked, I studied, I got myself here on my own. I am grateful for being raised, but this isn't about gratitude. This is Grandpa and Grandma's legacy, and they chose me. No one has the right to change that." My father went silent for a few seconds, then hung up without another word. I knew it was only the beginning of the psychological warfare they were about to unleash. The calls kept coming, their tone shifting like actors switching roles on stage. Sometimes soft, pleading, "Darling, I just want to keep our family together. Don't you care about your sister?" Sometimes accusatory, "You're selfish, only thinking of yourself." And other times, thinly veiled threats coated in sweetness. "If you don't listen, don't blame us when this family turns its back on you." I heard it all, memorized every line, and with each attempt I felt myself pulling further out of their grip. Because it was clear, what they wanted had never been love, only control and profit. The breaking point came when they began showing up at my doorstep in New York. I remember that night vividly. After a long day at work, I came back to my small apartment to find my mother's familiar Mercedes parked outside. She stepped out, draped in a beige silk dress, lips painted crimson, her eyes sharp as glass. Without waiting for me to invite her, she pushed the door open and stepped in, taking in the cramped space I called home with a disdainful sniff. Isabel, do you really think you're smarter than your parents? Do you think you can hold onto that house forever? Don't forget paper and ink can be rewritten. We have lawyers, we have ways to overturn this. If you sign now, everything will be much easier. I stood there, exhausted but steady. You can call as many lawyers as you like, but Grandpa and Grandma's will is legal. And I will not sign anything. She stared at me, then gave a thin, cold smile. You're as stubborn as your father. And you know exactly where that got him. Her words sent ice through my veins, but I refused to let her see me tremble. I opened the door and pointed outward. Leave, this is my home. She gave me one last glance, then walked out, her heels striking the floor like hammers, leaving behind the sharp sting of her perfume and an unspoken threat lingering in the air. It didn't stop there. Soon, anonymous letters began arriving, the handwriting unmistakably theirs, though unsigned. Each message carried the same warning. You will regret it if you don't share the inheritance. I photographed everyone, keeping them safe, knowing someday they might be needed as evidence. And then came Sophia, my sister, the one who had lived her whole life in luxury, calling me, sobbing into the phone. Sis, I don't want to lose you. You're tearing this family apart. I need that house. I need that money to start my career. Please don't be so selfish. I sat in silence, stunned. My entire childhood, I had been the one left on the sidelines, watching her receive everything. And even now, she still believed it was her right to claim it all. I answered quietly but firmly. Sophia, Grandma, and Grandpa chose me. Not you. And if you truly saw me as family, you would respect their decision. There was a pause on the other end, a silence heavy with disbelief, and then the line went dead. From that day on, Sophia never called again. Gradually, I began to realize that this was no longer just about dividing a house or a few $1,000,000. This was a battle for my voice, for my worth, the worth of the daughter who had always been dismissed, pushed aside, yet was ultimately entrusted with everything by my grandparents. Every threat, every unannounced appearance at my door, every false tear shed by Sophia only strengthened my resolve. They could strip me of affection as a child, they could deny my efforts, but they would never take away the one thing I still had: my grandparents' legacy, and the unshakable belief that I was worthy of keeping it. I received a call from my mother just moments after stepping out of the auditorium on my graduation day. The familiar word flashed across the screen. Mom. I hesitated before answering. Her voice came through softer than ever, as though all the tension of the past months had been erased. Isabel, congratulations on graduating, she began. Your father and I want you to attend a family meeting this weekend. At the main house in Connecticut. It's important, don't be absent. I listened carefully, a chill running down my spine. She called it a family meeting, and the way she emphasized the phrase made it sound less like a conversation and more like a trial. In my memory, this family had never once gathered for an actual meeting unless there was conflict or drama. And I knew what awaited me would not be reunion, but a carefully staged legal trap. That night, I sat at my desk, a notepad before me, listing every possible scenario. My parents never did anything halfway. If they had already planned to involve lawyers, then they had also prepared an escape route for themselves. As I flipped through old files, one name surfaced in my mind: Jonathan Reed. Jonathan wasn't just my grandparents' personal attorney, he was their confidant, the man they trusted above anyone else. He had drafted their will, set up the trust, and defended their interests against shady business partners more than once. I had met him several times during his visits to the farm, and he always treated me with a respect few other adults in my family ever had. I knew that if there was anyone who could truly understand this situation and stand by me, it was Jonathan. I called him the next morning. His deep, steady voice brought with it a rare sense of calm. After I told him everything, he fell silent for a moment before speaking. Isabel, this could very well be an ambush. Your parents may have lined up lawyers, forged documents, even psychological tactics to pressure you into signing. You need to be prepared. And remember this, never go alone. I sighed. But if I tell them I'm bringing an attorney, they'll change the script. I won't know what new tricks they're planning." Jonathan thought for a moment, then replied, "Then don't tell them. Show up on time, sit down, listen. When the moment is right, I'll walk in. Let me handle the rest." Hearing those words eased something heavy inside me. I had a hidden card to play, one my parents would never expect. I imagined my mother's face when she saw Jonathan, the very lawyer my grandparents had trusted most, stepping in to dismantle her schemes. The thought alone gave me strength. Still, unease crept into the quiet hours of sleepless nights. I couldn't help but wonder, would they stop if they failed this time? Or would they keep coming back, finding ways more ruthless, more dangerous than before? In the days leading up to the meeting, I began gathering every document I might need. Copies of the will, bank statements, official inheritance certificates, all neatly organized in a single folder. I also printed out the text messages, the letters, and even the anonymous threats I had received before. I knew that in this battle, thorough preparation would be my strongest armor. On top of that, I purchased a small recorder, tucked discreetly into my pocket, ensuring that every word spoken in that meeting would be captured as evidence. I was no longer the cornered daughter with no defense. I was the granddaughter entrusted by my grandparents, and I had a duty to protect that trust. The night before the meeting, sleep eluded me. Sitting by the window of my apartment, watching the New York skyline glitter with lights, I thought of my grandfather. His words echoed clearly. "You are the only one we trust to preserve the values of our family." I nodded to myself, as if repeating a vow. I knew tomorrow would be difficult, but I also knew I wasn't walking in alone. I had Jonathan, and above all, I carried the strength of my grandparents' love and the memories no one could ever take from me. At 7 o'clock sharp the next morning, I slipped into a light gray suit, simple but dignified, a silent statement that I was ready. I drove out of New York, the long road to Connecticut stretching before me. I didn't know exactly what awaited, but I knew one thing. This time, I would not retreat. And as I imagined the moment they slid those papers across the table, I allowed myself a small smile. I already knew the words I would say, interesting, because I brought someone of my own. And I arrived at the Connecticut estate right on time, my heart pounding as I walked down the gravel path toward the house that had never once felt like home. With its pristine white fences, gleaming glass windows, and perfectly trimmed lawns, the house had always felt more like a stage set than a place of belonging. Outsiders might see it and imagine a perfect family. But, stepping through its doors, the illusion always shattered. Today, it was worse. The air was thick with tension, heavy with staging and intent. The butler opened the door, forcing a polite but uneasy smile. I stepped into the grand living room, the same room my parents often used to host cocktail parties for their wealthy friends. But this time, there was no laughter, no background music. The space had been arranged like a miniature courtroom. At the head of the polished walnut table, my parents sat side by side, composed like judges. To the left sat Sophia, her blonde hair styled meticulously, her cream-colored dress so elaborate she looked as though she were preparing to walk onto a stage rather than attend a family meeting. And to the right, two men in dark suits, their faces expressionless, stacks of documents neatly spread before them, clearly, the lawyers. The moment I took my seat, my mother spoke, her voice sweet but edged with authority. "Isabel, I'm so glad you came. Today, we're going to resolve everything once and for all, so the family can move forward in harmony." I glanced around, lifting the corner of my mouth into the faintest smirk. Harmony? With lawyers, paperwork, and calculating stares circling me, this was no family meeting. It was a trial, and I was the one in the defendant's chair. One of the lawyers opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of papers, and slid it across the polished table toward me. "This is the property settlement agreement," he said in a flat, practiced tone, "to ensure fairness for all members of the family." I flipped through the first page, and with just one glance the intent was unmistakable. The entire Vermont house and the investment portfolio would be transferred to Sophia Hart. I lifted my eyes, and they met the triumphant smile of my sister. Sophia tapped her manicured nails lightly against the table, as if waiting to watch me crumble. My father leaned forward, his voice deep and falsely reassuring. Isabel, you know these things are too much for you. You've just graduated, you don't have management experience. Meanwhile, Sophia. She has leadership qualities, she understands investment, and she'll know how to preserve the family's assets. I stayed silent, listening as he dressed blatant favoritism in flattering words. He had never once seen my true worth, never acknowledged the years I fought for scholarships, the nights I worked to keep myself afloat. My mother's voice followed, sharp under its sweetness, each word cutting deeper. Darling, family comes first. If you insist on keeping everything, you're tearing us apart. Giving Sophia her share isn't a loss, it's an act of love. I believe your grandparents would want to see their granddaughters living in harmony. Pals. The words burned inside me, a bitter fury rising in my chest. She dared invoke my grandparents, the very people who had signed their will, leaving everything to me to justify her greed. And then Sophia, unable to contain herself, leaned in with a voice dripping in false innocence. Sis, I know you love me. If you hand it over, I'll be grateful to you forever. You already have a job, you don't need the burden of this too. Each word felt like a slap across my face. All through childhood, I had sacrificed so she could have everything: birthdays, attention, recognition. And now, even when my grandparents had finally chosen me, she still treated taking from me as her right. I drew in a slow breath, lowering my eyes to the stack of papers, pretending to study them. It masked the small smile tugging at my lips. Let them think I was hesitating, that I was weighing their words, that I was still the Isabel of the past, easily overwhelmed, easily silenced. I turned page after page, letting the silence stretch, watching my parents' confidence grow. My father gave my mother a slight nod, and she placed her hand on Sophia's shoulder, as if the victory were already theirs. Then, I set the pen down on the table and raised my head. A slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. How interesting, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room, so quiet it seemed you could hear a pin drop. Because I brought someone of my own. Lou. In that instant, the entire room froze. My father's brow furrowed, confusion darkening his expression. My mother blinked rapidly, her face paling before settling into a cold, stony mask. Sophia glanced around nervously, her eyes flickering with unease. The two lawyers exchanged anxious looks. And then, the heavy doors of the living room swung open. Jonathan Reed stepped inside, tall and lean, clad in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, the familiar leather briefcase in hand. His stride was calm, deliberate, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room before settling firmly on my parents. Apologies for the delay, he said, his voice deep and unyielding. I am the legal representative for Isabel Hart, and I believe we have some matters to clarify. The room seemed to turn to stone. My mother's complexion drained of color, my father's grip on his glass tightened so hard his knuckles blanched, and Sophia lowered her eyes, lips trembling. For the first time in years, I saw fear flicker across their faces, and in that moment, I knew the balance had shifted. Jonathan set his briefcase down on the table, opening it with deliberate calm that radiated authority. He drew out a thick file, flipped through a few pages, and then took the so-called settlement agreement my parents' lawyers had just slid to me. He skimmed it quickly, raised an eyebrow, and looked up. His voice cut through the silence, steady and resonant. Let me be perfectly clear, this document is entirely invalid. Not only does it violate the explicit wishes of the deceased, but it also bears clear marks of coercion and potential fraud. If anyone in this room attempts to use it to threaten or force my client into signing, you will be facing criminal charges. The air thickened, pressing down on everyone. My father coughed, struggling to maintain composure, though his fingers clenched so tightly around the glass it looked ready to shatter. My mother blinked rapidly, her face pale and taut, while Sophia stared wide-eyed, tears welling as though she couldn't comprehend how everything had turned against her. The two attorneys exchanged nervous glances, one leaning in to whisper something to my mother, who shook her head, her eyes burning with anger. This was the moment I had been waiting for. For the first time in 24 years under this roof, I stood not as the overlooked daughter, not as the shadow of the precious one, but as myself. Independent. Unafraid. I drew a deep breath, then spoke, my voice cutting clear through the silence. For 20 years, I have been treated as though I were a stranger in my own family. Every achievement of mine was diminished, every effort dismissed. Sophia was always the golden child, while I was nothing but a shadow. I stayed silent. I endured. I shouldered responsibilities without asking for anything in return, and now when my grandparents entrusted me with the only thing that is truly mine, you still want to take that away? Sophia broke down, tears streaming down her face as her trembling voice filled the room. You're so selfish. You always act like the victim. You have a master's degree, you have a job, and I'm just starting out. I just need one chance. Why can't you give that to me? I turned to her, meeting her gaze with an expression that no longer carried the softness of the past. You've had every chance, Sophia. You've had favoritism, money, support I never once received. You got a brand new car at 16, your tuition was fully paid, your birthdays were celebrated with lavish parties. I had to work shifts just to afford textbooks. And now, the only thing our grandparents left me, a sliver of recognition, a fragment of trust. You want to take that too? My words sliced through the room, tearing down the veil of pretense. Sophia stammered, unable to speak, her shoulders trembling. My father slammed his hand down on the table, his voice low and thunderous. Enough, Isabel, you will not speak like that. We are your parents, we have the right to decide what's best for this family. I turned toward him, meeting his fiery glare head-on, and for the first time in my life, I did not lower my eyes. No, father. Our grandparents had the right to decide, and they chose me. You cannot erase their decisions simply because of greed. My mother, who had worn her mask of gentle composure all this time, finally lost control. A cold, mocking smile curled on her lips as she spat her words. Do you really think you're special, Isabel? Your grandparents pitied you, that's all. They left you the inheritance because they knew you'd never stand on your own without clinging to the past. The words stabbed at my chest, but I forced my voice to remain steady. If they truly believed that, they would have left everything to you. But they didn't. They knew you would sell it all for a handful of parties and empty luxuries. They knew I was the only one who would honor the true value of this legacy. At that moment, Jonathan cleared his throat and pulled out another folder from his briefcase. He dropped it firmly onto the table, sliding it across to the opposing lawyers. These are the full legal documents regarding the will and the trust. Everything has been verified, notarized, and filed with the Vermont court system. And this, he added, producing a single sheet of paper, his voice sharp and final, is a cease and desist order. From this moment on, any attempt to harass, threaten, or pressure Isabel into signing over her inheritance will be considered a violation of the law. If it continues, we will file suit immediately. The paper landed on the table with a dry, final thud, the punctuation mark to end the charade my parents had so carefully staged. I watched their faces shift, drained of confidence. My father flushed red with rage but stayed silent, his jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. My mother froze, her eyes darting as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. Sophia buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly, the sound of her cries echoing in the silence that followed. In that moment, I felt a strange wave of relief wash over me. Not because I had won some grand battle, but because at last I had spoken aloud all the words that had been buried inside me for years. I was no longer the small Isabel, drowned out in every conversation. I had stood up, defended myself, and protected the legacy my grandparents entrusted me with. And seeing the panic flicker in their eyes, I knew for the first time the balance of power had shifted. I thought it was over after that meeting. Jonathan had laid the cease and desist order right in front of them, and my parents' lawyers didn't dare argue further. When Jonathan and I gathered our documents and rose from the table, it felt as though I was walking out of a hidden courtroom, victory in hand. At the door, Jonathan gave a firm nod, reminding me to stay cautious but assuring me the law was on my side. I nodded, feeling some of the weight lift from my shoulders. But just as I stepped down the front steps of the mansion, my mother's voice cut through the air, drawn out, cold, slicing through the silence like a knife. "Be careful with that house, Isabel, accidents can always happen." I froze. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end, my heart hammering against my ribs. That wasn't concern, wasn't care. It was a threat, raw and deliberate. I turned back and saw her smirk, her eyes gleaming with a mix of challenge and mockery. My father stood at her side, saying nothing, his lips pressed tight in silent complicity. Sophia kept her head bowed, but I knew she had heard every word. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to remain steady. I didn't respond, I simply turned away. Yet, all the way back to New York, her words looped in my mind like a haunting refrain. Accidents can always happen. 3 days later, that vague fear became reality. It was a Saturday morning when I decided to drive up to Vermont to check on my grandparents' old house, the place I hadn't fully moved into yet because the memories there were still too heavy. But when I stepped inside, my chest tightened as though caught in a vice. The front door had been forced open, its hinges bent. Footprints tracked across the wooden floors. Every room had been torn apart, drawers yanked out and flung aside, the sofa slashed open, stuffing scattered everywhere. In the living room, a framed photo of me with my grandparents on my first day of high school lay shattered, the glass splintered, the picture ripped and crumpled on the floor. But the most chilling sight was on the wall at the very center of the house, smeared in red paint, hurried but bold, stood a single word: thief. I stood frozen, my hand trembling as it covered my mouth, my vision blurring with tears. Thief? Me, the only grandchild my grandparents had trusted, now branded with that word by my own family. The destruction wasn't about stealing, nothing of value had been taken. It was a message, carved in paint and venom. We will never let you live in peace. I called the police immediately. They arrived, took photographs, filed a report. But in the end, they only shook their heads. No clear fingerprints, no cameras, no witnesses. We'll make a record, but I'm afraid there isn't much more we can do. A bitter laugh nearly escaped my lips. Who else could it be but my parents and Sophia? But in the eyes of the law, I had no proof. All I was left with was a ransacked house and memories ripped apart all over again. When the officers left, I sank down on the front steps, staring out at the forest where my grandfather once walked with me. The scent of resin and earth was still there, but now it was drowned out by the stinging smell of fresh spray paint in the living room. It felt as though I had lost my grandparents all over again. That night, I drove back to New York with a heart heavy as stone. I called Jonathan and told him everything. He listened quietly, then spoke firmly. Isabel, this is escalation. They've crossed a line. I advise you to increase security immediately. Install cameras, new locks, whatever it takes to gather evidence. If they try again, next time we'll have something concrete to bring to court. I nodded through tears, but my voice was steady. They trusted me. I won't let them destroy the only thing I have left of them. The next morning, I returned to Vermont with a security company. I asked for the most advanced system available, cameras covering every angle. The front gate, the back door, the hallways, the garage, even the porch where my grandfather and I once sat drinking tea. Everything was connected directly to my phone, sending alerts the moment any movement was detected. I also replaced every lock, reinforced the windows. When the technicians left, I stood alone in the house, now bristling with electronic eyes. I felt both safer and more sorrowful. The home that had once been my refuge now had to be guarded like a fortress because my own family had turned into enemies. That evening, I sat in the living room, the acrid red stains on the wall still visible where the paint hadn't yet been scrubbed away. I opened an old photo album. Pictures of me with my grandparents, simple meals around the wooden table, their genuine smiles, all of it reminded me why I had to keep fighting. This was no longer just a dispute over property. It was a battle for memory, a fight to protect the promise I had made to them, that I would never let anyone destroy what they had built with their lives. And in that moment, a new resolve surged through me. If my mother had warned me that accidents can happen, then I would turn her threat into evidence. If they dared come back again, this time I would have everything in my hands to expose them. I was no longer the small Isabel of the past. I was ready for whatever came next. That night, I remember clearly, it was a bleak Wednesday, a light rain falling over Vermont. I had just returned to New York after a long shift at work, about to sleep, when my phone buzzed. It was an alert from the security system. Motion detected in the backyard. My heart seized. I opened the app, and the image that appeared froze me in place. In the dim light of the motion sensor lamp stood three familiar figures: my father, my mother, and Sophia. My father carried a red gasoline can. My mother held a flashlight, pointing deliberately, signaling this way and that. Sophia trailed behind, head bowed, clutching her coat tightly. The footage was sharp, clear, so clear, there could be no denial. I could barely believe my eyes. A chill ran straight down my spine. This wasn't a letter, wasn't paint on a wall. This was a real plan, calculated, dangerous, vicious. My hands shook, but I still managed to dial 911. The operator's voice came through. 911, what is your emergency? I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady. My parents are trying to set fire to my grandparents' house in Vermont. I have live security footage, they're carrying gasoline. The dispatcher asked for the address, and I recited every word clearly. Moments later came the response: units have been dispatched, stay on the line and keep recording. Has. On my phone screen, I saw my father splashing gasoline around the porch, my mother shining the light, pointing where he should pour. Sophia hovered behind them, visibly shaken several times, lifting her hands as if to stop them, but too afraid to follow through. My lip bled from how tightly I bit down, trembling with rage. That house was where my grandparents had lived their entire lives, filled with memories, the only legacy they had left me. And the people I once called family were trying to turn it into ashes, all for greed and spite. Then suddenly, sirens pierced the night. 2 police cruisers sped into the driveway, red and blue lights flooding the yard. I watched through the screen as panic spread across their faces. My father dropped the gasoline can, my mother quickly shoved the flashlight behind her back, and Sophia broke down, covering her face with her hands. But it was too late. 3 officers rushed forward, shouting commands to raise their hands. My father tried to argue, his voice shaking. We were just here to check on the house. But when the officers shined a flashlight on the half-empty can of gasoline spilled across the ground, his words turned absurd. One officer picked it up, sloshed it gently, and nodded. Pure gasoline. Care to explain this? My mother went pale, stammering. We only brought it for the backup generator. But the footage told the truth, footage of my father pouring gasoline across the porch, and the truth was undeniable. I sped down the road, heart pounding like a drum, arriving just in time to see them being handcuffed. As I stepped out of my car, my mother screamed, her eyes bloodshot. Isabel, you set us up. How could you do this to your own family? I stood tall, looking at her for a long moment before answering, my voice calm, almost unnervingly steady. No, Mother. You did this to your own family. My father kept his head down, silent, while Sophia trembled, her tear-filled eyes locked on me as if begging. But I could not soften anymore. At the station, the interrogation dragged on until morning. My parents tried everything to deny their guilt. My father insisted he was just checking on the property, for fairness. My mother pushed the blame onto Sophia, saying she had wanted to see the house and they had merely followed. But the cameras had recorded everything, every drop of gasoline hitting the ground, every gesture, every hurried step. No excuse could erase what the footage revealed. Sophia collapsed into sobs, repeating over and over. I didn't know, I had no idea. I was just following them. The police took her statement, but her mere presence at the scene was enough to shatter the perfect golden girl image my parents had spent years building. The story spread quickly. Local newspapers ran headlines about a wealthy Connecticut couple arrested for attempted arson of inheritance property. Public outrage ignited. People gossiped endlessly about greed and cruelty. And Sophia, once seen as the sweet, perfect younger daughter, became the subject of shame. Even though she hadn't poured the gasoline herself, simply standing there, complicit in silence, destroyed her reputation. Social gatherings that once celebrated her turned into spaces buzzing with whispers. Friends drifted away, and social media lit up with biting comments. Golden girl or accomplice? Months later, the trial began. I sat in the gallery, Jonathan by my side. My parents walked into the courtroom, still carrying a trace of pride in their posture, but their eyes betrayed exhaustion and bitterness. The prosecutor laid out everything: the footage from the security cameras, the officers' testimonies, even chemical analysis of the gasoline stains on the porch. It was airtight. The defense lawyer struggled, spinning weak arguments about misunderstandings, claiming the gas had been for another purpose. But when the video was projected on the big screen showing my mother pointing, directing my father as he poured the fuel, it silenced every excuse. I watched my mother's face twist as the images played, and for the first time, I didn't feel small before them anymore. The verdict came down. My parents were convicted of conspiracy to destroy property and issuing threats. They received a 3-year suspended sentence and hundreds of thousands in fines. They lost their standing, their reputation, their respect in the community. Sophia wasn't criminally charged, but she had to testify as a witness, her eyes swollen, her voice quivering. From that moment on, everything my parents had built around her golden girl image crumbled into nothing. When I walked out of the courthouse, I paused on the steps, taking in a long breath. The sky was clear, the sunlight pouring down brilliantly. I knew this wasn't just a sentence for my parents. It was a sentence on all the years of injustice, on every moment I had been pushed aside. I had risen, not only to protect the inheritance, but to protect myself. And when I glanced at Jonathan, who gave me a small nod, I heard my grandfather's voice echo within me. "You are the only one we trust to preserve the values of our family." I had done it. After the trial, when the sentence had been declared and the very names that once overshadowed me were now condemned by the community, I returned to Vermont. The old house came into view as I turned down the familiar narrow road. This time, I didn't look at it with caution, afraid of hands waiting to destroy it. I looked at it with the eyes of someone truly coming home. Though the wooden door had once been forced open, though the wall had once been smeared with red letters spelling thief, what I saw now was a house waiting to be healed just like myself. I began by restoring the small details. The wooden dining table where I once sat listening to my grandfather's stories had been scratched and stained with gasoline. I brought it to a restorer, keeping its original grain intact. The torn photo frames I carefully gathered, patched, and reframed before hanging them back on the walls. I replanted the garden my grandmother once tended. Rows of lavender blooming purple, little pots of herbs sprouting fresh green. Each morning, as sunlight spilled through the window, I sat with a cup of tea and felt as though my grandparents were still there somewhere, smiling at me for keeping my promise. In those first days of living alone in the house, the silence felt different from the cold silence of my parents' home. This was a warm silence, one that allowed me to breathe, to hear the birdsong in the forest, to speak with my memories. I began keeping a journal, recording each step of change, each feeling of restoration. I realized my true victory wasn't measured by how much money or land I managed to keep. It was in reclaiming my dignity, the value my parents had spent years denying. I had proven to myself that I was no longer the child pushed aside. The inheritance my grandparents left was substantial. After covering the costs of repairs and security, I invested most of it into long-term savings, some into stocks, and set aside a portion to create a scholarship fund in their name. That fund now helps underprivileged students chasing their dream of education, students like I once was, struggling to find scholarships to keep going. I wanted them to feel that someone believed in them, the same way my grandparents had believed in me. Every time I signed approval for a new student scholarship, I remembered the moment my grandfather held my hand and said, "You are the only one we trust to preserve the values of our family." I understood then that I was fulfilling that wish not by locking wealth away in a safe, but by carrying forward the values of love and fairness. The community in Vermont also began to see me differently. At first, there were whispers and gossip about my family's scandal. But then they saw me steadily restoring the house, joining charitable efforts, and they saw the scholarship fund making a real difference in people's lives. Some of my old neighbors came by with small gifts, sharing stories about my grandparents that I had never heard. They told me my grandparents had quietly helped many struggling families in the area, never asking for recognition or display. And in that moment, I realized I was simply continuing the path they had always walked. Sophia still tried, every now and then, to reach out short messages like, "Sis, I'm sorry, I didn't know things would go this far." But I never replied. I no longer carried anger toward her, but I also knew some distances can never be bridged. My silence was my choice, a way to protect my own peace. As for my parents, after their suspended sentence, they almost disappeared from social circles. They no longer had any power over me, and for the first time, I felt relief in not having to prove anything to them anymore. 1 year later, the old house had been fully restored. Each morning, I sat at the dining table that had been carefully repaired, sunlight streaming through the windows, lighting up the photo frames back in their rightful places. I saw my grandparents smiling in those pictures, and I smiled back. I knew I had kept my promise. I had protected what they entrusted me with, but more importantly, I had protected myself. Looking back on the entire journey, I understood one truth. The real victory wasn't about what I owned, but about learning to say no to injustice, learning to stand up for my own worth. I had walked through pain, betrayal, and threats, yet I held on to my dignity. And that was the true legacy my grandparents left behind. I closed my journal, writing the final lines. My grandparents left me more than a house. They left me a lesson. To protect myself, to never yield to injustice, and to live with dignity. That is the real inheritance. If you have ever been hurt by your own family, remember this: it does not mean you are unworthy of love. If you have ever been belittled, pushed aside, or made to feel invisible, believe that your true value does not lie in their eyes, it lies in the way you rise, and build a life of your own. If I could rebuild myself from those wounds, then so can you. Don't be afraid to set boundaries. Don't be afraid to walk away to find your peace. Because sometimes, real family is made of those who honor and respect you, not of blood. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.